The smell of scorched garlic hit Marcus Chen's nostrils 3 seconds before the smoke alarm began its banshee wail. Not the pleasant, nutty brown of properly caramelized cloves, but the acrid, bitter stench of something dying on high heat. Amateur heat. Panic heat. His hands moved before his mind caught up, reaching for a pan that wasn't there, in a kitchen that didn't exist. Instead, his fingers closed around the cheap polyester of a hospital blanket. The fluorescent lights above hummed their monotonous song, that particular frequency that lived somewhere between a migraine and a prayer. His mouth tasted like copper and antiseptic, his throat raw from something he couldn't remember. Through the thin curtain surrounding his bed, he could hear the rubber squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum. The distant beep of machines measuring out lives in digital increments. Marcus blinked. The ceiling tiles had water stains that looked like continents he'd never visit. "Mr. Chen, you're awake?" The nurse who swept aside the curtain had kind eyes and tired hands. She checked the IV in his arm with practiced efficiency, her fingers cool against his skin. "You gave everyone quite a scare. Collapsed right in the middle of your sister's engagement party. How are you feeling?" Sister's engagement party. The words should have meant something. Should have triggered joy or annoyance or the complicated knot of emotions that came with family obligations. Instead, they landed in his chest like stones in still water, sending ripples through memories that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. "What day is it?" His voice came out like gravel. Thursday, March 15th. She smiled, adjusting the flow of whatever cocktail of fluids they were pumping into his veins. "You've been out for about 6 hours. The doctor will be in soon to check on you. Your family's in the waiting room. Should I send them in?" "No." The word came too quickly, too sharp. He softened it with effort. "Not yet. I need a minute." The nurse's expression shifted to something between concern and understanding. She'd probably seen it all in this place. People waking up to lives they didn't want to return to. Reality settling back onto shoulders like a yoke. "I'll tell them you need rest. Press the call button if you need anything." When she left, Marcus closed his eyes and tried to make sense of the chaos ricocheting through his skull. March 15th, Lila's engagement party. The borrowed restaurant with the subpar ventilation, and the menu Marcus had spent 3 weeks planning even though he was supposed to be studying for his CPA exam, even though he hadn't touched a professional kitchen in 7 years, even though... Wait, 7 years. Marcus's eyes snapped open. He stared at his hands, really looked at them for the first time. No burn scars, no calluses from knife work, no permanent stain under his thumbnail where he'd cut himself filleting a salmon and the blood had mixed with beet juice. His hands were soft, unmarked, the hands of someone who pushed papers and clicked keyboards. The hands of a 32-year-old accountant. But that wasn't right, was it? Because he was 47. He had been 47. He had lived those years, so he felt them accumulate in his joints and his bank account and the hollow space where his dreams used to live. The memories came like a flood breaking through a dam. Flash. His mother's face, tears streaming, hands clasped. "Marcus, please. Your sister needs braces, needs tutoring. You know your father's business is struggling. Culinary school can wait. Just a few years at the accounting firm. Just until we're stable." Flash, 25 years old, sitting in his apartment, the acceptance letter from Le Cordon Bleu Paris crumpled in his fist. The deadline had passed. The deposit, non-refundable. Gone. Flash, 35 years old, watching Lila. Perfect golden Lila, except her medical school diploma. The diploma he'd paid for with overtime and weekends and every scrap of joy he could have carved from his own life. A Flash, 47 years old, alone in his sterile apartment, ordering takeout Thai food while Lila texted photos from her honeymoon in Santorini. The message, "Thanks again for the generous wedding gift. You're the best big brother ever." Flash, the heart attack. Sudden, catastrophic. Falling in his living room with a half-eaten container of pad thai spilling across the carpet. The certainty in those final moments that he had wasted everything, been everyone's support beam while building nothing of his own. Marcus's breath came short and fast. The heart monitor beside him started beeping faster, climbing in pitch. This was impossible. Impossible. People they didn't. But the smell, that burnt garlic. He knew that smell because he had burned it himself tonight at Lila's engagement party. trying to salvage a dish in the restaurant's inadequate kitchen while she laughed with her fiancé and her friends, while his mother reminded him not to forget to smile for photos, to not overshadow Lila's special day. 24 years old. He was 24 years old again. The doctor who examined him 40 minutes later was young, competent, and utterly baffled by Marcus's test results. "Everything looks normal," Dr. Patel said, scrolling through charts on a tablet. "Blood work is clean. EKG shows no abnormalities. Your collapse was likely due to a vasovagal response, stress, heat, dehydration. Have you been sleeping enough? Eating regularly?" Marcus almost laughed. Sleeping? He'd been sleeping for 15 years in his first life. A walking coma, going through motions, depositing paychecks, watching other people live while he paid their bills. "I'm fine," he said. "I can go home? I'd like to keep you overnight for observation, but if you're insistent..." Dr. Patel gave him the look of someone who knew his patient was going to do exactly what he warned against. "At least wait until morning. Let us monitor you for a few more hours." "Fine. Morning." After the doctor left, Marcus lay in the sterile darkness and mapped out the architecture of his second chance. If this was real, and every cell in his body screamed that it was, that somehow he'd been given the rarest gift in existence, then he knew exactly what was coming next. Tomorrow, his mother would visit. She would sit by his bed and hold his hand and tell him how worried she'd been. Then, casual as a snake, she'd mentioned that his father's struggling restaurant supply business needed a cash infusion, that Lila needed help with her pre-med tuition, that Marcus had such a good job at Whitman & Associates, such a stable future, and wasn't it wonderful how he could help family when they needed it? In his first life, he'd said yes, had liquidated his culinary school savings account, every penny he'd earned from his part-time sous chef position at Maison Bissay, $23,000 gone in an afternoon. He'd told himself it was temporary, that he'd go to culinary school next year, the year after. Eventually had never come. But now he knew the truth his younger self hadn't wanted to face, that his family would take and take and take, always with love in their voices and poison in their needs. That Lila would become a surgeon who saw him 3 times a year and never remembered his birthday. That his mother would praise his generosity while planning her next request. That his father would nod and say nothing, complicit in his silence. Marcus stared at the ceiling and felt something old and tired slough off him like dead skin. He was done being generous. At 6 a.m., Marcus pulled out his IV himself, dressed in yesterday's clothes that someone had folded neatly on the chair, and walked out of the hospital before the shift change. The nurse at the station called after him, but he kept walking, down the elevator, through the lobby with its tired fake plants and its smell of coffee and catastrophe. The morning air hit his face like baptism. March 16th, 24 years old. The whole world stretched ahead of him like unmarked dough, ready to be shaped. His apartment, a studio in Riverside that he shared with 2 roommates in his first life, economizing to save money for family emergencies that were always just around the corner, sat waiting. But Marcus's feet carried him past the bus stop, past the subway entrance, walking with purpose toward a destination his body remembered, but his mind had almost forgotten. The West Side Farmers Market. It was early, vendors still setting up their stalls, the air sharp with the scent of wet pavement and fresh herbs. Marcus wandered through the rows like a penitent returning to a shrine. Here, a table piled with heirloom tomatoes, their skins still cool from the morning harvest, colors ranging from deep purple to striped green and gold. There, to the bundles of asparagus thick as his thumb, their tips tight and perfect, baby lettuce in jeweled greens, radishes like pink gems. His hands moved without thought, selecting, feeling, knowing. The vendor at the tomato stand, a woman with sun-weathered skin and sharp eyes, watched him with interest. "You know your produce," she said. "I used to cook." The words came out rough. "I mean, I do cook. I will cook," she smiled. "Well, you've got good hands for it. Those are the Cherokee purples, best tomatoes you'll ever eat. I picked them yesterday afternoon." Marcus bought 3 pounds, spent money he should have been saving, bought asparagus and butter lettuce and a bunch of basil so fragrant it made his eyes water, bought eggs from a farm stall, their shells still bearing traces of the coop, and a loaf of sourdough from a baker who shaped his bread the old way, by hand and instinct. Back at his apartment, Marcus's roommates were still asleep. He set his bounty on the kitchen counter, really just a corner of the main room with a 2-burner hot plate and a microwave that worked intermittently, and stared at it like a battle plan. In his first life, after he'd given up cooking professionally, he'd let this skill atrophy. Ordered takeout, microwaved frozen dinners, forgot what it felt like to create something beautiful from raw ingredients. By the time he was 47, he could barely remember how to hold a knife properly. But muscle memory was a strange thing, and apparently, it transcended death. Marcus found a cutting board, a knife that was duller than it should be. He began to slice the tomatoes. And it was like coming home after a long war. The knife moved through the flesh, releasing that green, earthy smell that was summer and sunshine and every good thing he'd abandoned. He sliced the asparagus on a bias, precise angles, tore the basil with his fingers to release the oils. By the time his roommate Josh stumbled out in boxers and a ratty t-shirt, rubbing sleep from his eyes, Marcus had plated a simple dish, tomatoes and asparagus, barely cooked, dressed with olive oil and lemon, topped with torn basil and a poached egg. "Dude," Josh said, staring, "what is this?" "Breakfast. We have Pop-Tarts." Marcus slid the plate across the counter. "Try it." Josh picked up a fork with the suspicion of someone who'd been living on ramen and cereal for 3 years. He took a bite. His expression went through several stages. Confusion, surprise, something approaching religious experience. "Holy shit," he said around a mouthful. "Holy shit, Marcus. When did you learn to cook like this?" "Long time ago." Marcus was already plating a second dish, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime in kitchens. Or would have, should have. Different life. "Well, this is incredible. You should, do this professionally or something." The laugh that escaped Marcus's throat was sharp enough to cut. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe I will." His mother arrived at his apartment at 2 p.m., carrying a casserole dish and the weight of expectation. "Marcus, sweetheart," she said, sweeping in like she owned the place, setting the casserole on the counter without asking. "You scared us half to death. Collapsing like that. The doctor said you're fine. But I think you've been working too hard. You look thin. Are you eating enough?" She was exactly as he remembered. Small, energetic, with the kind of beauty that aging had refined rather than diminished. In his first life, he'd loved her without question, had believed every word that came wrapped in maternal concern. Now, with the clarity of 15 wasted years, he could see the calculations behind her eyes, the way she was already planning her pitch. "I'm fine, Mom." "You don't look fine, you look exhausted." She moved around the tiny kitchen like she was inspecting a crime scene, taking in the evidence of his morning cooking. The tomato seeds on the cutting board, the pan still glossy with olive oil. "Have you been cooking? I didn't know you still did that." "I never stopped wanting to." She paused, something flickering across her face. Then she smiled, bright and dismissive. "Well, it's a nice hobby, but don't let it distract you from work. Speaking of which, your father and I wanted to talk to you about something." Here it was, right on schedule. Marcus sat down at the small table, gestured for her to do the same. His hands were steady. In his first life, they'd been shaking, already knowing what she was going to ask, already knowing he'd say yes. "The business," he said. It wasn't a question. His mother's eyes widened slightly. "How did you—" "Well, yes, your father's been having some cash flow issues. Nothing serious, just a temporary shortage. But you know how these things are. One late payment, and suddenly suppliers won't extend credit. We need about $15,000 to smooth things over." In his first life, he'd had $23,000 in savings. He'd given them 17, kept 6 for emergencies. The emergency had been Lila's spring break trip to Cancun 2 months later, which of course she needed because all her pre-med friends were going, and she couldn't be left out. "No," Marcus said. The word hung in the air like a slap. His mother blinked. "What?" "I said no, Mom. I'm not giving you money for Dad's business." "Marcus." Her voice took on that particular tone, the one that had always worked on him before. Part hurt, part disappointment, wholly manipulative. "This is family. Your father has worked so hard to build that business. We just need a little help to get through this rough patch. You have a good job, savings—" "I have culinary school tuition," Marcus interrupted. "My acceptance letter came last week. Le Cordon Bleu Paris. Full scholarship. I just need to cover living expenses and materials. That's what my savings are for." This was true. In both timelines, the letter had come. The scholarship was real, a miracle he'd earned through talent and determination, through the dishes he'd created in Maison Bizet's kitchen after hours, through the portfolio he'd submitted on a prayer. In his first life, he'd let it expire. His mother's face went through a complicated dance. Paris? Marcus, that's wonderful, but you can't be serious. You're 24 years old. You have a career at Whitman and Associates, a real career with benefits and stability. Cooking is a lovely hobby, but it's not practical. And your father needs... Dad's business has been temporarily struggling for 7 years, Marcus said, his voice level. Every time you ask me for money, it's temporary. Emergency. Just this once. When does it end, Mom? That's not fair. We're family. Family helps each other. And what has the family done for me? The question landed like a stone. His mother recoiled as if he'd struck her. What has the family done for you? Marcus, we raised you, fed you, put a roof over your head. That's called being a parent? That's the minimum requirement? Marcus felt the old anger, the one he'd swallowed for 15 years, rising like bile. I'm not asking you to pay me back for my childhood. I'm asking you to let me live my own life, to stop treating my dreams like they're negotiable. This is about Lila, his mother said, her voice going cold. You're jealous of your sister. This has nothing to do with Lila. It has everything to do with her. You've always resented how much attention she needs. How her medical school requires support. But she's going to be a doctor, Marcus. A doctor. That's worth investing in. And I'm going to be a chef. A good one. Maybe even a great one. Why is her dream worth $15,000 of my money, but mine isn't worth protecting? His mother stood, her chair scraping against the floor. The casserole sat forgotten on the counter, some beige offering he'd never asked for and wouldn't eat. You're being selfish, she said. Childish. When you calm down and think about this rationally, you'll realize that family comes first. Your father and I have always supported you, supported me in doing what you wanted me to do. That's not the same thing. We wanted you to have stability. You wanted me to have stability so I could bankroll everyone else's dreams. The silence that followed was the kind that ended things. Marcus could see it in his mother's face. The moment she realized that guilt and obligation weren't going to work this time, that something fundamental had shifted in her dutiful son. If you do this, she said, her voice low and dangerous, if you refuse to help your family and run off to Paris to play chef, don't expect us to be here when you fail. Don't expect us to pick up the pieces when you realize cooking won't pay the bills and you need your old job back. Marcus stood, walked to the door, opened it. I won't fail. Everyone fails, Marcus. For especially people who chase childish dreams instead of accepting reality. Then I'll fail on my own terms. Goodbye, Mom. She left without taking her casserole. Marcus locked the door behind her and stood in the center of his tiny apartment, his heart hammering, his hands shaking with adrenaline and terror, and something that felt remarkably like freedom. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. His phone rang 10 minutes later. His father, voice tight with disappointment. Marcus sent it to voicemail, then Lila texting a string of angry emojis and accusations. He blocked her number, then his mother again, this time leaving a voicemail about how she'd never been so hurt, and how could he abandon his family in their time of need. Marcus deleted it without listening to the end. Then he sat at his laptop, opened his email, and then pulled up the acceptance letter from Le Cordon Bleu Paris. His hands hovered over the keyboard. In his first life, the deadline had passed, but now he was 3 days early. He clicked accept, filled out the housing forms, submitted his deposit. When it was done, when the confirmation email arrived with its cheerful welcome to Le Cordon Bleu, he closed his laptop and let himself cry for the first time in years, for the life he'd lost, for the life he'd just chosen, for the terror and the joy and the enormous weight of a second chance. Then he wiped his eyes, went to the kitchen, and started planning what he'd make for dinner. Cooking, after all, was what he did. Paris in autumn was a cliché that Marcus had never understood in his first life, experiencing it only through Lila's Instagram posts from her honeymoon. Now, he is stepping out of Charles de Gaulle Airport into air that smelled of diesel and rain and possibility. He understood why people wrote poems about this place. The city was a revelation. Not the tourist Paris of postcards and romance, but the real Paris. the one that woke at 5 a.m. with bakers pulling dark loaves from stone ovens, where fishmongers at Rungi's market shouted prices for Dover sole and turbot, where butchers broke down entire pigs with knives older than Marcus's grandparents. Le Cordon Bleu sat in the 15th arrondissement, a building that looked unremarkable from the outside and contained multitudes within. Marcus's first class was Basic Cuisine 1, despite his years of experience at Maison Bisset. He didn't argue. Starting from the beginning felt right, like rebuilding a foundation that had cracked in his first life. Chef Arnaud Beaumont was the kind of instructor who could reduce grown adults to tears with a single raised eyebrow. 60 years old, with hands scarred from a lifetime of burns and cuts, he moved through the teaching kitchen like a priest through a cathedral. Everything was sacred here. The way you held a knife, the angle of your wrist when whisking, the temperature at which you brought butter to room temperature. Cooking, he said in heavily accented English during the first lecture, is not about following recipes. Recipes are training wheels. What we teach you here is technique, yes, but also understanding. You must know why butter breaks, why eggs coagulate, why flour becomes elastic. You must know these things in your hands, in your blood, so that when you are in a kitchen at midnight and something goes wrong, you can fix it. You can create. You can transform. Marcus absorbed it all like a man dying of thirst. Every technique, every principle, every small secret that separated adequate cooking from transcendent food. He stayed late in the practice kitchens, working through knife skills until his hands cramped, making stocks from scratch, learning to break down a chicken in 45 seconds, then 30, then 20. His classmates were a mix of culinary school kids fresh from high school and career changers like himself. There was Amélie, a former lawyer from Lyon who'd quit her firm to pursue her grandmother's recipes. Kenji, a Japanese businessman who'd decided at 40 that life was too short not to learn French pastry. And Sophie, 19 years old, terrifyingly talented, with the kind of palate that made Chef Beaumont actually smile. They became his crew, his kitchen family. Late nights turned into early mornings at a dive bar in Belleville, where the bartender made them cassoulet if they helped clean up. They tested recipes on each other, argued about technique, shared war stories from their shifts at the restaurants where they externships. Marcus got placed at L'Astrance, a Michelin-starred restaurant in the 16th. He started as the lowest of the low, prep cook, the person who peeled carrots for 6 hours and julienned vegetables until his fingers bled. But he watched everything, studied how Chef Pascal Barbeau composed his dishes, how flavors were balanced not just on the plate but across an entire meal. How a great restaurant was like a symphony, each course a movement, building toward crescendo. 3 months in, Marcus was promoted to poissonnier, fish station. Another 3 months, and he was working guard manger, cold appetizers, where precision was everything, and timing meant the difference between perfect and garbage. He learned French by necessity, picking up culinary terms first, then insults, then eventually entire conversations. He learned to drink coffee standing at the bar like a local, to navigate the metro without looking at maps, to find the best bread in a city obsessed with bread. But most importantly, he learned to cook with the kind of precision that only came from understanding every variable. Temperature, timing, technique, these were the foundations. But layered on top was something else, something Chef Beaumont called cuisine de l'âme, soul cooking, the ability to taste a dish and know not just what it needed technically, but what it needed emotionally, and whether it wanted brightness or depth, elegance or comfort. This was the skill Marcus had begun developing in his first life, but never fully realized. Always too tired from his day job, always too preoccupied with family obligations. Now, free from those chains, he could chase perfection with single-minded focus. One night in his second year, working a brutal dinner service at L'Astrance, everything came together. The restaurant was fully booked. 60 covers, each one a 12-course tasting menu. Marcus was on the meat station now, responsible for the lamb course, rack of lamb with rosemary juice, roasted salsify, and a puree of Jerusalem artichokes that needed to be perfectly smooth, perfectly seasoned, perfectly warm. The orders came rapid fire. 2 lamb, fire now. 4 lamb, 4 minutes. 6 lamb. Dying on the pass. Marcus moved like he was dancing, searing the lamb racks in a screaming hot pan, the fat rendering and crisping, the smell of rosemary and garlic blooming in the heat, transferring them to the oven, precise timing, meat thermometer checking internal temperature, medium rare, 130 degrees, not a degree more or less. resting the meat while he plated the puree, piping it in perfect quenelles, arranging the salsify like pickup sticks, each piece exactly the same length, slicing the lamb against the grain, 6 pieces per plate, fanned in a perfect arc, drizzling the juice, not too much, just enough to pool at the bottom and catch the light. Microgreens as garnish, just a whisper of green. "Lamb pass," he called, sliding the plates to the expediter. Chef Barbeau, who was running the pass tonight, looked at the plates. When looked at Marcus, gave him the smallest nod. In a kitchen where praise was rarer than truffles, that nod meant everything. The service continued, a controlled chaos that Marcus had learned to navigate like a sailor reading stars. By the time the last order was fired, he'd cooked 60 lamb courses without a single send-back, without a single complaint. His chef's whites were splattered with fat and sauce, his feet screaming, his hands raw from the heat. He'd never felt more alive. After service, the kitchen crew sat outside in the alley, smoking cigarettes, everyone but Marcus, who'd never picked up the habit, and drinking cheap wine from coffee cups. The night air was cold, autumn bleeding into winter. But after the inferno of the kitchen, it felt like salvation. "Good service tonight," said Jean-Baptiste, the sous chef. A man of few words who normally communicated in grunts and knife-point gestures. Coming from him, it was basically a declaration of love. Marcus leaned back against the brick wall and let exhaustion wash over him. Somewhere across the ocean, in a life that felt increasingly distant, his family was probably sitting down to dinner. His mother might be mentioning him, wondering aloud why he never called, painting herself as the victim of an ungrateful son. Lila might be complaining about her coursework, secure in the knowledge that she'd never have to worry about money because someone had always taken care of it for her. They would never understand what he was building here, would never comprehend that these brutal hours, these screaming chefs, these burns and cuts and exhausting nights were exactly what he needed. That every perfectly cooked lamb chop was an act of defiance, proof that he'd been right to choose this. "What are you thinking about?" Sophie asked, passing him the wine. She'd finished her program 6 months ago and was now working as a commis at Guy Savoy, climbing her own ladder. "Just that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She smiled. "That's a dangerous thing to think. It means you're happy." "Why is that dangerous?" "Because happy chefs get complacent, and complacent chefs stop growing." Marcus took a sip of wine, cheap table red that tasted like vinegar and heaven. "Then I'll be a happy chef who refuses to get complacent. Is that allowed?" In France, anything is allowed if you do it with enough conviction. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the occasional car pass on the street beyond the alley. In a few hours, they'd be back here starting prep for tomorrow's service. The cycle would continue: chop, cook, plate, clean, repeat. And Marcus couldn't wait. Graduation from Le Cordon Bleu came with top honors and a job offer from Chef Barbeau to stay on at L'Astrance as a junior sous chef. Marcus accepted, spent another 3 years there learning everything he could about fine dining at the highest level. How to manage a kitchen when the head chef was away. How to train new cooks. How to create dishes that weren't just technically perfect but emotionally resonant. But by his 5th year in Paris, Marcus felt the familiar itch. He'd learned what he needed to learn. Now it was time to build something of his own. He found the space by accident, walking through the Marais on a rare day off. A tiny restaurant, shuttered and sad, with a "for lease" sign in the window. It couldn't have held more than 25 covers, wedged between a vintage bookstore and a wine shop. The kitchen was a disaster. Ancient equipment, terrible ventilation, barely enough space to turn around. Marcus signed the lease the next day. He named it Cendres. Ashes. Because that's what he'd risen from. The concept was simple. An 8-course tasting menu that changed nightly based on what was fresh at the markets. No substitutions, no modifications. You trusted the chef or you went somewhere else. It was an arrogant concept for a no-name American chef in Paris. Everyone told him he was crazy. Even Amélie, who'd become his closest friend, thought he was moving too fast. "You should work a few more years," she said, helping him paint the dining room a deep charcoal gray. "Well, build your reputation. Save more money, then open a restaurant." "I'm 29 years old," Marcus said. "I've already wasted enough time." She didn't understand, couldn't understand. How could he explain that he'd already lived a life of caution, of waiting for the right moment, of putting dreams on hold? This life, this second chance, was for action. Cendres opened on a Tuesday in November. 6 people showed up. Marcus cooked for them like they were royalty, plating dishes that represented everything he'd learned and everyone he'd been. Roasted pigeon with cherry gastrique and cocoa nibs, a nod to his childhood love of his mother's chocolate cake, sea bass with fennel and blood orange, remembering that first meal he'd cooked in his shabby apartment, beef cheek braised in red wine until it fell apart at the touch of a fork. The hours of work transformed into a single perfect bite. The 6 diners left full and confused, not sure what they'd experienced, but certain it was something different. Word spread slowly at first. A food blogger came, wrote a glowing review, then a critic from Le Fooding, then impossibly a scout from Michelin. Marcus knew the Michelin scout was there the moment she walked in. There was a quality to the way she observed everything, not just tasting the food, but watching how it was presented, noting the service, the atmosphere, the complete experience. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and sharper taste, and she ate in complete silence, making occasional notes in a small leather journal. That night, Marcus made her a menu that drew on everything he was, technically precise, but emotionally raw. A play on the dish he'd made for his roommate Josh all those years ago, tomatoes and burrata, but elevated with heirloom tomatoes that cost more than most people's dinner. Burrata made that morning by a master fromager, basil oil, that had been infused for 3 days. Simple, perfect, impossible to improve. When she left, she shook his hand and said nothing. Professional distance. But he saw something in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or approval. 3 months later, the Michelin guide came out. Cendres, 1 star. The night Marcus found out, he sat alone in his empty restaurant after close and let himself feel the weight of it. 1 Michelin star, the mark that separated good restaurants from great ones. The achievement that chefs spent entire careers chasing. He'd done it in less than a year. So, his phone was full of congratulations. Messages from his former classmates, from Chef Beaumont, from Sophie and Amelie and Kenji, from everyone who'd been part of this journey. He answered them all, grateful and gracious. His family's silence was deafening. He hadn't spoken to them in 5 years. Hadn't heard his mother's voice. Hadn't seen Lila's face except in the occasional Google search he allowed himself in moments of weakness. They'd made their choice when he'd chosen Paris. He was a disappointment. A selfish son who'd abandoned his family for a pipe dream? Let them think that. Let them live in their small world of resentment and obligation. He was building something bigger. The first Michelin star changed everything and nothing. More reservations, yes. Cendres was now booked 3 weeks in advance. More pressure? Certainly. Every dish had to be perfect, had to justify that star. More scrutiny from critics, food bloggers, Instagram influencers who treated dining like performance art. But the cooking itself? That stayed the same. Marcus still arrived at 5 a.m. to receive deliveries from the markets. Still broke down fish with the same precision he'd learned at Le Cordon Bleu. Still tasted every sauce, adjusted every seasoning, supervised every plate that left his kitchen. The difference was in what he allowed himself to attempt. With the star came freedom to push boundaries. Marcus started experimenting with techniques he'd only read about. Sous vide cooking that could hold meat at the perfect temperature for hours. Spherification that turned liquids into delicate pearls. Smoking techniques borrowed from Nordic cuisine. See fermentation projects that took weeks to develop the right flavor profiles. His menu evolved into something that walked the line between classical French technique and modern innovation. A dish might look like traditional coq au vin, but taste completely different. The chicken poached in red wine reduced to a glaze, served with a broth that had been clarified until it was diamond clear, vegetables pickled and preserved to add acidity. Familiar and alien at once. The critics didn't always understand it. Some praised his innovation. Others accused him of gimmickry, of sacrificing soul for technique. Marcus didn't care. He was cooking for himself now, chasing a vision that existed only in his head, trying to create food that made people feel something beyond simple satisfaction. He hired staff carefully. Sophie came on as his sous chef, Nia having grown tired of the politics at Guy Savoy. A young pastry chef from Lyon named Marcel, who could spin sugar into architecture and make chocolate mousse that tasted like clouds. Front of house was managed by Isabelle, a former sommelier who could read customers like sheet music and knew exactly which wine would elevate which dish. Together they turned Cendres into something rare, a restaurant with a soul. The kind of place where regulars knew the staff by name, where first-time diners felt like they'd discovered a secret, where even on the hardest nights, there was joy in the work. 2 years after the first star, the Michelin Guide came out again. 2 stars. Marcus was 31 years old and one of the youngest chefs in Paris with 2 Michelin stars. The achievement should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt like pressure crystallizing into diamond, because now there was only one direction left to go. 3 stars. The peak. The summit that most chefs never reached, that required not just technical perfection, but something transcendent, food that changed the way people thought about eating, about cuisine, about possibility itself. Marcus knew he could get there. The question was whether he was willing to pay the price. Because the truth about Michelin stars, the thing no one told you until you were deep in the game, was that each star cost something. The first star cost him his family, his old life, everything comfortable and safe. The second star cost him any pretense of work-life balance, any relationship that couldn't accommodate the fact that he lived in his restaurant. The third star would cost him pieces of himself he hadn't even identified yet. On a rare night off, Marcus met Amélie for drinks at a wine bar in Saint-Germain. She'd opened her own place 2 years ago. A casual bistro serving her grandmother's Lyonnaise cuisine. No Michelin stars, no tasting menus, just honest food that made people happy. Her restaurant was always full. "You look tired," she said, studying him over her glass of Sancerre. "I'm always tired. No, I mean tired in your eyes, like you're running on fumes and force of will." Marcus wanted to deny it, but she wasn't wrong. Sleep had become a luxury he couldn't afford. There were menus to plan, staff to train, suppliers to negotiate with. And beyond the practical concerns, there was the constant pressure of his own ambition, the voice in his head that whispered, more, better, perfect. "I'm close to something," he said. "I can feel it. A menu that's going to change everything." Change everything for whom? For the Michelin inspectors? Or for you? "What's the difference?" Amélie set down her glass. "Marcus, I love you like a brother, but you need to hear this. The third star is a trap. It's the thing that destroys chefs. They get so obsessed with perfection that they forget why they started cooking in the first place." "I know exactly why I started cooking." "Do you?" Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're chasing validation from people who will never give you enough of it. The words stung because they were partially true. Marcus had told himself he was cooking for himself, for art, for the pure joy of creation. But there was a part of him, a wounded part that still remembered his mother's dismissal, his family's certainty that he'd fail, that needed to prove them wrong, that needed the third star like proof of concept. "This is my second chance," Marcus said quietly. "I can't waste it." Living only for work is also wasting it. They sat in silence. Outside, Paris continued its endless dance, oblivious to their small existential crisis. Finally, Amélie sighed. "Just promise me something. When you get the third star, and you will, because you're brilliant and obsessive and those are the 2 requirements, promise me you'll ask yourself if it was worth it." Marcus promised, though he already knew the answer. It would be worth it. It had to be. The menu that would change everything came to Marcus at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday in March. 6 years after he'd opened Cendres. He'd been lying awake, chasing sleep that wouldn't come, when the idea crystallized with perfect clarity. A menu that told the story of time itself, not literal time, not clocks and calendars, but the way time affected ingredients, transformation, memory. Each course would represent a different temporal concept, from the instantaneous to the eternal. The first course, oysters served 3 ways. Raw, barely touched, representing the present moment. Cooked lightly with champagne mignonette, representing the immediate past. And transformed into an oyster custard with caviar, representing memory, how we reshape raw experience into something else entirely. The second course, vegetables at different stages of their life cycle, sprouts representing birth, perfectly ripe produce representing prime, fermented vegetables representing decay and transformation, all on one plate, all speaking to each other. The third course, fish that had been aged for different periods, 1 day, 1 week, 1 month. Each slice showing how time developed umami, changed texture, revealed new flavors. And so on through 8 courses, each one a meditation on temporality. The final course, the one that made Marcus's hands shake when he thought about it, would be a dessert that combined the ancient, honey that had been aging for 5 years, with the modern, a liquid nitrogen frozen mousse, with the eternal, a simple Madeleine, Proust's vessel for recovered time. It was ambitious to the point of absurdity. It required techniques he'd never attempted, ingredients that would take months to prepare, a level of precision that left no room for error. Sophie, when he explained it to her the next day, was silent for a long moment. Then, "You're insane." "Probably." "This menu will kill us." "Probably." "When do we start?" They spent 3 months in development. Marcus pulled favors from every supplier he knew, convinced farmers to grow vegetables specifically for this menu, worked with a fishmonger in Brittany to develop an aging process for fish that wouldn't kill anyone with food poisoning. He brought in a food scientist from INRA to help with the more experimental elements, to ensure that innovation didn't sacrifice safety. The testing process was brutal. Dishes that seemed perfect in concept failed in execution. The oyster custard split the first 17 times they made it. The aged fish developed off flavors. The dessert's temperature contrast didn't work. But slowly, through trial and error and countless iterations, the menu came together. By June, they were ready. Marcus announced the new menu with a simple notice on Sondres's website, Le Temps Perdu, a meditation on time and transformation. 8 courses, prix fixe, beginning July 1st. The reservations filled in 4 hours. Opening night of the new menu, Marcus stood in his kitchen and felt the familiar pre-service nerves. His team was ready. Sophie on hot appetizers, Marcel on desserts, the line cooks positioned at their stations like soldiers before battle. Front of house, Isabel was briefing the servers on the concept, the story behind each dish. "Remember," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the kitchen noise, "this isn't just food. It's a conversation about time. Every plate tells a story. Make sure that story is perfect." "Yes." "Un chef," came the chorus. Service began. The first orders fired, and Marcus fell into the rhythm he knew better than breathing. Plating the oysters with hands that didn't shake, arranging the 3 preparations so they created a narrative arc on the plate. The servers carried them out like sacred offerings. Through the kitchen window, Marcus could see the dining room. The customers' faces as they tasted the first course, the confusion giving way to understanding, giving way to delight. One diner, an older woman with white hair and elegant hands, closed her eyes when she tasted the oyster custard. Marcus saw her mouth move, saying something to her companion. A memory, perhaps. A moment from her past called forth by a combination of salt and butter and brine. This was why he cooked, not for stars or critics or validation. For this, the ability to give someone a perfect moment, to transform ingredients into emotion, to stop time for the space of a meal. The service continued. Course after course, each one landing exactly as Marcus had envisioned, the vegetables speaking to each other across the plate, the aged fish revealing its secrets in layers, the lamb that had been cooking for 48 hours in a water bath, tender enough to cut with a spoon but still maintaining its essential lambness. By the time dessert service began, Marcus's feet were screaming and his chef's whites were a disaster of stains and splatter. Marcel was piping the frozen mousse with the concentration of a surgeon, the honey aged in chestnut barrels glowing amber under the lights. The final plates went out. Through the window, Marcus watched his diners experience the dessert. The shock of cold from the nitrogen-frozen mousse, the deep, complex sweetness of aged honey, the simple comfort of the Madeleine, past, present, and future in a single bite. When service ended and the last customers had left, lingering over coffee, reluctant to return to the world, the kitchen staff collapsed into chairs, too exhausted to celebrate. That, Sophie said, was either genius or suicide. "Why not both?" Marcus replied. 2 weeks later, the reviews started coming in. Le Figaro called it a revelation. Omnivore magazine devoted 6 pages to dissecting each course. Instagram exploded with photos that couldn't possibly capture what the food actually tasted like. And then, 6 months later, the Michelin inspector came. Marcus knew her this time. So not her name. Michelin inspectors were anonymous as gods. But the quality of her attention, the way she observed not just the food but the entire experience, from the greeting at the door to the way plates were cleared between courses. She ordered Le Temps Perdu. Of course she did. That night, Marcus cooked like his life depended on it. Because in a way, it did. This was the culmination of everything. His second chance, his rebellion against family expectations, his years of brutal training, his vision of what food could be. Each course had to be perfect. Not just good, not just great. Perfect. The oysters glistened on the plate, each preparation distinct but harmonious. The vegetables were arranged like a painting, the sprouts still dewy fresh, the fermented elements adding a funk that should have been wrong but was exactly right. The fish, delicate, aged perfectly, showing flavors that took days to develop, practically melted on the tongue. Through the service, Marcus was hyper-aware of every second, every movement. He plated each course himself, unwilling to delegate, needing to control every variable. Sophie gave him concerned looks, but said nothing, understanding that this was beyond rational behavior, that sometimes obsession was the only appropriate response. The dessert went out last, Marcel's frozen mousse still smoking from the liquid nitrogen, the madeleine warm from the oven, the honey catching the light like trapped sunshine. The inspector ate slowly, methodically, took notes, showed no emotion. When she left, she stopped at the kitchen door, a break in protocol, and looked directly at Marcus. "Merci, chef," she said. Just that. 2 words. Then she was gone. The waiting was agony. The Michelin Guide would be released in March. From December to March, Marcus existed in a state of suspended animation, unable to think about anything except what verdict those 2 words might have meant. Merci, chef. Was it acknowledgement, approval, or just politeness? He threw himself into work, developing new dishes, training his staff, maintaining the insane standards that 2 stars demanded. But underneath everything was the constant hum of anxiety, the knowledge that this was what he'd built his entire second life toward. Amélie tried to distract him, forced him to take a day off, dragged him to the Louvre, made him look at art that had existed for centuries and would exist for centuries more, trying to give him perspective. "You know they're going to give it to you," she said. Standing in front of the Mona Lisa, surrounded by tourists taking selfies with a painting they'd never really look at. "I don't know anything. I know, I've eaten at your restaurant 50 times. What you're doing is magic, Marcus. They'd be idiots not to recognize it. Michelin has made worse decisions." They stood in silence, watching the crowds flow past. Finally, Amélie said, "And if they don't give it to you, what then?" Marcus didn't have an answer, because the truth was, he'd staked everything on this. Not just his career, but his entire conception of this second chance. Proof that he'd been right to abandon his family, right to choose this insane profession, right to believe that talent and determination could overcome circumstance. If he didn't get the 3rd star, what did it all mean? "I'll keep cooking," he said finally. "Oh, because that's what I do." It sounded braver than he felt. The Michelin Guide was released on a Monday morning in March. Marcus didn't sleep the night before, couldn't eat breakfast, stood in his empty restaurant at dawn feeling like he might vomit from anxiety. Sophie arrived at 6 a.m. with coffee and croissants from his favorite bakery. "Whatever happens," she said, "we did something beautiful." "I know." "Do you?" Marcus looked at his sous chef, his friend, the person who'd been beside him through all of this. "I know we did the work. I know we gave everything. I know we created food that mattered." "Then that's enough. The stars they're just other people's opinions of work that's already done." She was right, of course, but it didn't make the waiting easier. At 9 a.m., the guide went live online. Marcus sat in his office, Sophie standing behind him, both of them staring at his computer screen like it contained the secrets of the universe. His hands shook as he navigated to the Michelin website, found the Paris section, scrolled through the alphabetical listing of restaurants. Cendres, 3 stars. The screen swam. Marcus blinked, certain he was hallucinating, that anxiety had finally broken his brain. But the text stayed the same: Cendres, exceptional cuisine, worth a special journey. Chef Marcus Chen's Le Temps Perdu is a meditation on transformation that transcends the boundaries of traditional French cuisine. Technically flawless, emotionally resonant, and utterly original. A master at the height of his powers. Sophie's hands landed on his shoulders, squeezing. She was crying, he realized. Tears running down her face. Or laughing and crying at once. "You did it," she said. "You actually did it." Marcus couldn't speak, couldn't process. 3 stars, 3 fucking stars. The achievement that most chefs spent entire lifetimes chasing, that required not just skill but vision, not just technique but soul. He was 33 years old and had reached the summit. His phone exploded with messages, texts, calls, emails, all blurring together into a tide of congratulations. Amelie, Kenji, former classmates, Chef Beaumont, his old instructor, sending a simple message. I knew you would. Everyone who mattered was reaching out. Except, of course, his family. That night, after the celebration dinner with his staff, after the champagne and the tears and the exhausted elation, Marcus sat alone in his apartment. A much nicer one now. Overlooking the Seine, and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd accomplished. 3 Michelin stars, one of only a handful of chefs in Paris with that distinction, one of the youngest ever to achieve it. An American, an outsider, who'd done it through sheer force of will and talent. His first life, he would have been 47 now, probably still at Whitman and Associates, pushing paper, living in that sterile apartment, ordering takeout, watching his family from a distance. Maybe by now he would have dated someone, settled into a comfortable mediocrity, convinced himself it was enough. Instead, he was here. He'd built this. He'd transformed himself from a burned-out accountant into one of the best chefs in the world. The achievement should have felt complete, should have filled the hollow place inside him. But sitting there in his expensive apartment, looking out at the lights of Paris reflected in the river, Marcus felt something uncomfortably like emptiness. He'd reached the summit. Now what? The answer came 3 weeks later from the most unexpected source. His father called. Marcus stared at the phone screen, at the name he hadn't seen in almost a decade, and felt his entire body go rigid. His first instinct was to decline the call, block the number, maintain the wall he'd built between himself and his old life. But curiosity, or maybe something darker, like the need to prove what he'd become, made him answer. Hello? Marcus. His father's voice was older, rougher, but unmistakably his. I know I don't have the right to call, but I saw the news about your restaurant. 3 Michelin stars. I'm proud of you. Son. The words landed like shrapnel. Marcus felt anger rise in his throat, hot and bitter. You're proud of me. You're proud of me now. Where were you when I needed you to stand up to Mom? When I needed you to tell her I had the right to choose my own life? I was a coward. His father's voice cracked. I know that. Your mother, she has very specific ideas about what success looks like, and I went along with it because it was easier than fighting. I failed you, Marcus. I know I did. Marcus wanted to hang up, wanted to cut this connection cleanly, maintain his righteous anger, but he could hear something in his father's voice. Genuine regret, maybe, or genuine old age at least. Time that had passed for both of them. Why are you calling? Marcus asked. What do you want? Nothing? I don't want anything except to tell you that I was wrong, that you were right to follow your dream, that I wish I'd had your courage. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Marcus said, Is this Mom's idea? Is she behind this call? Your mother doesn't know I'm calling. She's sick, Marcus. Stage 3 breast cancer. She's undergoing treatment, and it's giving her time to think about things, about how she treated you. I think she wants to reach out, but she doesn't know how. Sick. His mother was sick. Marcus waited for the surge of emotion, concern, fear, anything, but he felt oddly detached, like this was news about a stranger. I'm sorry she's sick, he said finally. I hope the treatment works. But you're not coming home. Paris is my home. Has been for almost a decade. I understand, his father sighed. I just wanted you to know, and to tell you what you've built, Marcus. It's extraordinary. I read the reviews of your restaurant. I looked at the photos. I don't understand half of what you're doing, but I can see that it's special, that you're special. I needed to hear that 9 years ago, Dad. I know. I'm sorry I couldn't give it to you then. After the call ended, Marcus sat with his phone in his hand and felt the complicated knot of emotions that family always brought. Anger at the wasted years, sadness for what could have been, and underneath it all, a weird sense of closure. His father had finally said the words Marcus had needed, even if they came too late to change anything. His mother's illness complicated things. Part of him, the dutiful son part that he'd tried to excise, felt like he should go home, should make peace. That should be there. But another part, The part that had been forged in fire and kitchen heat knew that some doors, once closed, should stay closed. That forgiveness didn't require forgetting, that he could acknowledge his mother's illness without absolving her of what she'd done. He'd chosen his path, she'd chosen hers. They'd both have to live with it. 2 years after the third star, Marcus opened his second restaurant. He'd sworn he wouldn't. One perfect restaurant was enough, was the dream. But he kept having ideas that didn't fit at Sandres, concepts that needed their own space, their own identity. And beyond that, he'd trained dozens of young cooks who deserved a chance to lead, to build their own kitchens. The new restaurant was called Ephemeral. It was Sophie's concept, something she'd been developing for years, a restaurant with no permanent menu. Every night was different, based entirely on what was available at that moment. Diners wouldn't know what they were eating until it arrived at their table. Marcus provided the backing, the infrastructure, the name recognition, but Ephemeral was Sophie's kitchen, her vision. He showed up once a week to cook a dish or offer advice, but mostly he stayed out of her way. The restaurant was an instant success. Within a year, it had its own Michelin star. Watching Sophie accept the accolades, seeing her grow into her own as a chef, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected. Satisfaction that had nothing to do with his own achievement. Pride, pure and uncomplicated, in someone else's success. Maybe this was what family should have felt like. Not obligation and sacrifice, but genuine joy in someone else's flourishing. On a cold November evening, Marcus was at Sandres, developing a new dish for winter. Venison with huckleberry, celeriac puree, and a juniper reduction, when Isabel came into the kitchen with a strange expression. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "Your sister." Marcus's knife stopped mid-cut. "My sister." "That's what she says. She's waiting in the dining room." He should have said no, should have sent her away. But curiosity, the same curiosity that had made him answer his father's call, made him wipe his hands and walk into the dining room. Lila sat at a corner table, looking out of place in her casual American clothes. Jeans and a sweater, a far cry from the Parisian elegance that surrounded her. She'd aged well, so it was still recognizably the golden child he remembered, but there were lines around her eyes, a tiredness that expensive skincare couldn't hide. "Marcus," she said when she saw him, "thank you for seeing me." He didn't sit. "What do you want, Lila?" "I wanted to talk, to apologize." She gestured at the empty chair across from her. Please? Against his better judgment, Marcus sat, but he didn't relax, didn't give her the comfort of familiarity. Lila took a breath. "I'm in Paris for a medical conference. When I found out you had a restaurant here, I had to come, had to see what you'd built." She looked around at the dining room, at the carefully curated space that represented years of Marcus's vision. "It's beautiful. The reviews don't do it justice. Get to the point." "I'm sorry," the words came out in a rush. "I'm sorry for everything, for being the one who always needed things, for letting Mom and Dad make you sacrifice your dreams for mine, for never questioning it, never wondering if it was fair." Marcus waited. There had to be more. "I got married," Lila continued. "Had 2 kids, got divorced, the whole American dream, except it turns out the dream is kind of a nightmare when you're working 80-hour weeks at the hospital and your husband resents you for making more money than him. I'm sorry that happened to you." "Are you?" She looked at him directly. "Because I wouldn't blame you if you weren't. I wouldn't blame you if you hated me." "I don't hate you, Lila. I don't feel much of anything about you, honestly. You're a stranger who happens to share my DNA." The words were cruel, but honest. Lila flinched. "Why, I deserve that." She twisted her hands together. "Mom told me about your success, about the Michelin stars. She pretended she didn't care, but I could tell it aided her. The fact that you did exactly what she said you couldn't do." "How is Mom?" Dad said she was sick. "In remission. The treatment worked. She's different now, or maybe just scared. She talks about you sometimes. Wonders if you'll ever come home. This is home." "I know, I can see that." Lila looked around again. "You built this. All of it. Without any help from us. Despite us, really?" "Yes. I'm proud of you." Marcus laughed, sharp and bitter. "Everyone's proud of me now. Funny how that works. When I needed support, when I was choosing between my dream and your needs, no one was proud. But now that I'm successful, now that I've proven myself without you, everyone wants to claim a piece of it." "You're right." Lila's eyes were wet. You're completely right, and I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what we took from you. What I took from you." They sat in silence. Outside, Paris continued its endless motion, indifferent to their small family drama. Finally, Marcus said, "Do you want to eat? As long as you're here?" Lila looked surprised. "I don't want to impose—" "You already did by showing up. Might as well get something good out of it." He went back to the kitchen, told Sophie to prepare a tasting menu, the full experience, everything. When he brought out the first course himself, Lila looked at the plate like it was a work of art. "What is it?" she asked. "Scallop, miso butter, pickled radish, apple?" She took a bite. Her eyes widened. Marcus returned to the kitchen, watched through the window as course after course went out to his sister's table, watched her experience his food, his vision, the thing he'd built when he'd walked away from her and everything she represented. There was a kind of justice in it, making her understand, through taste and technique, exactly what she'd cost him, showing her the life he could have had, would have had, if she'd never existed or at least never needed so damn much. But as the meal continued, Marcus felt his anger cool, because Lila was crying by the fourth course, not from sadness but from the overwhelming beauty of what she was eating. And he realized that he wasn't cooking to punish her. He was cooking because it was what he did, who he was. Separate from her and his family and all the old wounds, he'd won. But not because his family finally acknowledged his success, but because he'd succeeded regardless of their acknowledgement. That was the real victory. At 37, Marcus Chen was one of the most celebrated chefs in Europe. Cendres still held its 3 Michelin stars. Ephemera had climbed to 2. He'd published a cookbook that became a bestseller, taught master classes, judged cooking competitions, become the kind of name that meant something in culinary circles. But more importantly, he'd built a family. Not the biological kind, but the chosen kind. Sophie, now running her own empire. Amelie, whose bistro was an institution. Marcel, who'd gone on to open a pastry shop that had lines around the block. Kenji, back in Tokyo with his own Michelin-starred restaurant. The dozens of cooks who'd come through his kitchens and gone on to create their own magic. This was legacy. Not children or traditional succession, but knowledge passed down. Techniques shared, young talents nurtured. On a Wednesday in May, 13 years after he'd walked into Cendres for the first time, Marcus received a letter. Not an email, but an actual physical letter, delivered to the restaurant in an expensive envelope. Inside was an invitation to cook at the James Beard House in New York, a special event celebrating American chefs working abroad. They wanted him to create a menu showcasing his journey, his unique blend of French technique and American sensibility. Marcus stared at the invitation and felt something stir. He hadn't been back to America in 13 years. Hadn't set foot in the country that had raised him and that he'd fled from. Going back felt dangerous, like it might undo everything he'd built. But it also felt necessary. Completing a circle, he accepted. The James Beard House sat in a Manhattan townhouse, an unlikely temple to American cuisine. Marcus arrived 2 days before the event, jet-lagged and disoriented by a city that felt both familiar and alien. New York wasn't Philadelphia, but it was close enough to trigger memories. American rhythms, American English, American efficiency. He worked with a team from Cendres that he'd brought with him, setting up the kitchen, sourcing ingredients, preparing for a meal that would feed 70 people who'd paid significant money to experience his food. The menu was autobiographical. Dishes that represented key moments in his journey. The tomato and burrata that he'd made for his roommate Josh all those years ago. A modern version of his mother's chocolate cake, deconstructed and refined. The venison dish that had been on his menu when he earned his 3rd star. Each course was a memory, transformed through technique into something new. The night of the dinner, Marcus stood in the kitchen and felt the familiar pre-service nerves. But there was something else, too. A sense of completion, perhaps, or closure. He'd left America as a failure in his family's eyes, a disappointment who'd chosen selfishness over duty. He was returning as proof that the choice had been right, that dreams pursued with enough determination could become reality. Service began. Through the kitchen window, Marcus could see the dining room filled with food writers, critics, fellow chefs, industry people, and in the back, almost hidden, 3 faces that made his breath catch. His father, his mother, Lila. They'd come. Somehow they'd found out about this event and come. Marcus forced himself to focus, to cook, to create the meal he'd planned, regardless of who was watching. Each plate that went out was perfect, because that was the only standard he accepted. Between courses, his father came into the kitchen. It was a breach of etiquette, but Marcus didn't have him removed. "Your mother wanted to come back here," his father said. "To the kitchen, but she's afraid you won't want to see her." "Then why is she here?" "Because she needed to see this, to see what you became." His father looked around at the controlled chaos of service, at the team working in perfect synchronization. "I told her about the stars. No, about the restaurants, but she needed to see it, to understand." "And does she understand?" "I don't know, maybe. Ask her yourself after service." Marcus almost said no, but then he thought about Lila crying over his food, about the power of a meal to communicate what words couldn't. "Tell her to stay," he said. "After everyone leaves, tell her to stay." At midnight, when the last diner had left and the kitchen was cleaned and the staff had been dismissed, Marcus sat down at a table in the empty dining room with his parents and his sister. He'd plated 4 portions of the final course, the chocolate cake his mother's recipe remade. It sat between them, a edible bridge between past and present. "Eat," he said. They ate. His mother took a bite and went very still. Marcus watched her process the familiar flavors transformed, the chocolate cake of her kitchen remade through Valrhona chocolate and Madagascar vanilla, and techniques she'd never imagined. "It's my cake," she said finally, "but it's not." "It's what your cake taught me," Marcus replied. "About balance, about comfort, about how food can carry memory." His mother's hands shook. She set down her fork and looked at him directly for the first time all night. "I'm sorry, Marcus, for all of it. For not believing in you, for making you choose, for being so certain I knew what was best." The apology hung in the air. Marcus examined it, turned it over in his mind, tested it for sincerity. "You almost destroyed me," he said quietly. "You almost convinced me that my dreams didn't matter, that I didn't matter except as a resource for everyone else." "I know. I had to die to get a second chance. I had to live an entire wasted life before I understood that I deserved to choose myself." His mother frowned. "Die? Marcus, what?" He shook his head. She wouldn't understand. Couldn't. How could he explain rebirth to someone who'd never felt the weight of a life unlived? "It doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is that I did choose. I chose this, chose cooking, chose myself, and it was the right choice. I can see that now." His mother's voice broke. "I see what you built, what you became, and I'm sorry I wasn't there for any of it." Marcus looked at his family, this complicated, flawed, human collection of people who'd shaped him through their failures as much as their love. He could hold on to his anger, could nurse his grudges until they calcified into permanent walls. Or he could let it go, not forget, but release. Acknowledge the wounds without letting them define him. "I forgive you," he said, and meant it. Not because they deserved it, but because he deserved to be free of the weight. "I forgive all of you, but I can't go back. Can't be who I was. That person doesn't exist anymore." "We're not asking you to come back," Lila said. "We're just asking to be part of your life, whatever that looks like." Marcus considered. "Emails," he said finally. "Maybe visits on my terms. I'm in Paris, you're here, we'll probably never be close, but we can be something, family at a distance." It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. There was no dramatic embrace, no tears of joy, just a quiet acceptance that some damage couldn't be fully repaired, only acknowledged and moved past. But it was enough. Septa, Epilogue, The Taste of Freedom. Marcus returned to Paris carrying something lighter than what he'd arrived with. The weight of his past, the anger at his family, the need to prove himself. All of it had shifted, transformed into something he could carry without being crushed by it. At 39, he started mentoring young chefs full-time, created a foundation that gave scholarships to culinary students who couldn't afford tuition, who were being pressured by families to choose practical careers. Every year, he gave 10 young people the gift he'd had to fight for, the freedom to chase their dreams. At 42, he married a food writer named Claire, who understood his obsession with cooking because she had her own obsession with words. They lived in an apartment overlooking Parc Monceau and spent Sundays at the market. So choosing ingredients for elaborate dinners they'd cook together. At 45, he handed over the day-to-day operations of Sandres to Sophie and stepped back into an advisory role. Not retiring, but creating space for the next generation. He spent more time teaching, traveling, exploring the intersection of food and culture and memory. But every week, without fail, he returned to his kitchen, cooked a meal just for himself, or for Claire, or for whoever happened to be there. Simple food sometimes, complex other times. The results mattered less than the process, the meditation of knife work and heat and transformation. Because cooking, he learned, wasn't about Michelin stars or critical acclaim or family approval. It was about the fundamental act of creation, of taking raw ingredients and making something beautiful. It was about the moment when disparate elements came together and became greater than their parts. It was about time and technique and the alchemy that happened when you cared enough to pursue perfection. On his 47th birthday, the age he'd been when he died in his first life, Marcus stood in his home kitchen and made the same dish he'd burned at Lila's engagement party all those years ago. The garlic didn't burn this time. The aromatics released their fragrance at exactly the right temperature. The whole apartment smelled like possibility. Claire came into the kitchen, wrapped her arms around him from behind, rested her chin on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how life is like cooking," Marcus said. "You can follow someone else's recipe, do what you're told, make what's expected, or you can trust your instincts, take risks, create something uniquely yours." Very philosophical for a Tuesday. He laughed, turned in her arms, kissed her forehead. "I'm a chef. We're allowed to be philosophical about food." "And what did you create in this metaphorical life cooking scenario?" Marcus looked around his kitchen, thought about his restaurants, his students, his hard-won peace, thought about the life he'd built from ashes and determination and one impossible second chance. "Something worth savoring," he said. And it was true. Every moment of it. The struggle and the triumph, the loneliness and the connection, the bitter and the sweet. He'd taken the raw ingredients of a second chance and transformed them into something extraordinary. Not because he was trying to prove his family wrong, not because he needed external validation, but because he'd finally understood the most important lesson any chef could learn. The only person you need to cook for, in the end, is yourself. The rest is just garnish.